No.
My basic entry from sociology. But I'm interested in a lot. I'm interested in what constitutes a scientific worldview from a psychometric standpoint. How can we measure a scientific worldview? I'm interested in, actually, I mentioned sociology. I'm interested in the radicalization of sociology politically, which is its own thing. What else am I interested in? I'm interested in cultural evolution. I have so many interests. I'm interested in atheism and non-religion, in particular, whether political worldviews can be religious, or in what sense they can be religious. And I'm also interested in the notion of atheists being, which it's a mainstream belief, and I am myself an atheist. But a mainstream belief in sociology is that atheists are more moral than everyone else. They're just more morally enlightened, and this is mostly an assumption based on survey data. So if you ask atheists what they think about gay people or immigration or racial minorities or anything, they say that they are in favor of their rights and protections and so on. And you won't always get that response from evangelical Christians and others. But the question is, can we infer people's moral behavior from their attitudes? So atheists will appear on a survey very open-minded and accepting. Are they in fact that way in their personal life? Are they donating more to charity than religious people are? The data gets a little bit fuzzy when you look at behaviors. So those are just a couple of things I'm interested in. I'm also trying to get a research center together, as Justin mentioned, called the Skeptic Research Center, where we investigate the empirical basis of people's political attitudes, how strong they are, how they vary on all kinds of polarizing topics. So, I mean, I'm pretty much interested in everything. So I'll just stop.
Super curious to hear more about the difference between identification of belief system, right? So like I am, and insert religion, and then the actual effect of that outwardly stated belief system on action throughout life.
Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility that atheists and secular people in general, because they exist in more cosmopolitan social networks, so they're more likely to have a diverse religious array of friends, whereas evangelical Christians are more likely to have other evangelical Christians as friends. But the possibility is that the more cosmopolitan your social network, the more socially indifferent you become. Not more moral, indifferent. So you're okay with people doing whatever they're going to do. You're okay with people believing whatever they're going to believe. It's an interesting move to call those people more moral. It's possible that indifference looks like tolerance. And we just haven't settled that debate. It's possible that they are, in fact, more tolerant in some sort of active sense, or it's possible that secular people just stop caring about what other people do, and that looks like tolerance on surveys. What do you think,
That's
Justin, on that? I know we
Yeah,
talked.
that's kind of an interesting one, because one of the other things that Kevin and I have done was we've done research using the social listening tools that we have at Culture Pulse to analyze conversations on the political left. And we found that when you focus on sort of like the far left, you actually get a moral signature that looks like the far right. You get a very authoritarian signature. So even though they're preaching things like tolerance verbally, the moral signature that they're presenting this information in is like, you better do what we say or else. And there's very much this sort of like high in group aspect to the far left that is very similar to the far right. And so it does seem to be kind of interesting from a morality standpoint that when you analyze these groups and you actually look at, when you really zoom out and you go beyond what survey data can get, and you get to sort of like what you can get through, hundreds of thousands of tweets on different conversations, you do see that it's almost like if you go far enough left, you go back to the right, and if you go far enough right, you go back to the left, which is interesting because the extremes are the only people still really talking on Twitter, it seems, a lot of the time. And so a lot of people kind of have this assumption of like, oh, everyone else sits in the middle, in between everyone else on the far left and the far right. But what seems to be interesting is that in the social networks that you see online, that's not the case, because the people who are in the middle are no longer even in the conversation. Instead, the far left and the far right have direct contact to each other on online social networks in a way that they never had before, because they're not sort of limited by the gradient of like, oh, I have this political belief, so most of my friends do, but they're a little different, and so you have to go way through the network to find someone who's very different from you. And same with sort of like, oh, I live in this neighborhood and everyone kind of goes this way in my neighborhood. So you have to try and find someone very far away from you physically for them to be very far away from you ideologically, right? And that's why you get that uncle at Thanksgiving effect. It's like, oh, I only see him once a year, but this guy's crazy. It's because, yeah, well, he lives far away. The only thing that brings you together to stabilize that relationship are like holidays and feasts. But social networks basically allow the front lines to emerge, and that boundary between right and left to come full circle, and really butt heads. And so we see that really in interesting ways, not only in the real world data, but when we do the simulations of these social networks. What we're finding is that when that happens and you start to deplatform those people because they've been so charged up, hypercharged on the original network, when they leave, it's not like those people cease to exist. They just cease to tweet. But they go to Getter, they go to Gab, they go to Parler, they go to Minds, they go to, maybe they go to Facebook, they go wherever else they can, and they keep going. But this time, they've been radicalized. Not in the traditional sense of radicalized, but they've kind of like, they come in with all this energy of the argument, and then they go to this new platform and they just start firing guns, and then the algorithm kind of clumps the birds of a feather together. And that can be what facilitates the offline radicalization that actually drives potentially socially dangerous behavior.
Sam.
I think I picking up on what Kevin mentioned earlier that I thought had a really interesting ring to it is the idea that indifference looks like tolerance.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of like the definition of tolerance versus support? I mean, tolerance is, yeah, this is happening and I don't really care. I tolerate it. That's very different from support being, I like stand up and believe that minorities should have rights and that kind of thing. Like, there's a difference between being supportive of something and tolerating is just simply not reacting.
Yeah, so I think in some cases, so in the cases where there's active discrimination, removing that discrimination and being indifferent as to who you serve at your business, for example, would be a clear case of tolerance. The issue comes when tolerance becomes passiveness in the face of some sort of other kind of introduction of a new harmful activity. So for example, I'll just give you an easy example in higher education. There's a debate right now about whether or not we should get rid of GRE scores, whether we should not even look at GPA, basically whether we should admit all people that apply to a graduate program, just admit everybody, because if they have a low GPA, it's probably because they were oppressed or they had some kind of discrimination or something bad in their life happened. So we need to overlook GPA. Conversely, should we have standards for who we give a PhD to? Should we even require a rigorous PhD defense? Because maybe if someone isn't able to rise to the call of a rigorous PhD defense, it's just because of how much bigotry they're tired under the weight of discrimination that they've had to face. They're tired of the weight of injustice, and so they just don't have the time and the energy to put into a PhD defense. So at a certain point, passivity can produce its own form of corruption. If people fail to uphold standards of quality or standards of merit because they don't think that they have a moral justification to do so, because any failure to live up to a standard is prima facie a sign of discrimination or bigotry. And I see this just in left-wing settings, being in a university. A similar sort of debate is happening right now in K through 12. Should we remove standardized testing requirements? Should we just pass kids through regardless of their performance in schools and so on and so forth? So I think the issue of tolerance is relevant when there's some active form of discrimination. But it's possible also that the removal of standards, the removal of expectations can have negative consequences, and that passivity will facilitate those negative consequences. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. But I think ultimately what it sounds like we're getting to is the idea that tolerance isn't always good.
Right.
That sometimes we are tolerant of bad behavior.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean that's the tolerance paradox, right? Like, do you tolerate evil? And is that apathy healthy for you or the people that are around you, right? Where everyone really draws the line. You don't want to be completely tolerant, because then you really have no moral compass whatsoever. You want to draw the line somewhere and say, look, I've seen this injustice in the world. I need to say something about it. In a way, I think, Sam, you kind of hit the nail on the head in juxtaposing inaction and tolerance and apathy. In a way, it seems to be that tolerance is always defined subjectively, but we use it in an objective fashion when we're dealing with groups. We're like, oh, I'm tolerant of this and I'm tolerant of that. But really, you're basically saying, I've made a personal choice to exert only this much energy to prevent this or that from happening, in the assumption that it's different from me, right? And so people who are typically very tolerant aren't putting energy into trying to stifle a dialogue that they might not like, or in order to suppress people who don't look like them. Um, and so that's one of the things that seems to be kind of like an interesting way of potentially looking at it and measuring it, is like, how much energy is somebody putting into this? Because then on the other hand, intolerant people are largely putting in a ton of intolerant people are largely putting in a ton of energy into stifling debate, stifling conversation, pushing people into some sort of corner or box just because they're not like them. But because that's always relative, what looks like intolerance to another person is looks like tolerance to another. So it's very subjective in the way that value typically is.
Well,
There are countless examples of the pathology of this passivity.
And if you're sorry to interrupt, Kevin, if you're not talking, if you can mute, that'd be super awesome. Otherwise, anyway, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize there are countless examples of passivity causing problems. This sort of indifference causing the body positivity movement, for example. So if I'm a doctor and someone comes to my office and they're insecure about their weight, understandably, and I don't address the role of their weight in their high blood pressure, their diabetes, from a left standpoint, I'm being tolerant. I'm being passive to their what I should be kind of actively concerned about their weight, but I'm being tolerant, I'm being passive, and I'm not addressing it. That might actually do harm to that person. Or if you look at the riots in the summer, how many leftists justified the destruction of businesses during the summer when they didn't need to do that? They could advocate for decent and just treatment of racial minorities in the United States. At the same time, they can oppose the burning of buildings and violence, but you didn't often see that. You saw this sort of generic tolerance toward this destruction. So I think that passivity is incredibly pathological depending on the circumstance, but it can also be the height of morality. I shouldn't care if two gay guys want to get married. It's none of my business, and they're going to raise healthy kids and everything's going to be fine. So in the one case, passivity is clearly an ethical imperative, but in the other cases, passivity is just cowardice.
Well, and it sounds almost like it's really a language issue with the vernacular of how tolerance has been equated as support or acceptance, when like being intolerant of bad behavior is a good thing.
Yeah.
Is there
whenever you say like you should be everybody needs to be more tolerant, it's like, well, that doesn't actually mean much.
When someone's trying to break into your house, if you're tolerant, it's the wrong choice.
Right.
Yeah.
So is there anything that's not
Big Lebowski? I was a pacifist once, not in Vietnam, of course.
Is there anything here that's not subjective? Is there anything? Is there any way to draw a line between? Uh,
So I think there can be. Um, so for example, Kevin brought up the issue of, there being a very, I mean, it's a very small but vocal, minority on usually social media, for example, that are, they're calling themselves body positivity, and you have people who are morbidly obese, and they have honest health issues that need to be addressed. Like if they do not address them, they will, incur health issues that will shorten their life, just as an empirical fact. And so in those instances, it's not subjective. Like if someone is morbidly obese, it needs to be addressed. And we know where the science is, and we know that there are gray zones and that there's curves to all of this. But we do know that if you come in and you're 5'2" and you weigh 300 pounds, that's not good. Like you can't do that. You will die an early death. And at that point, certain people in certain contexts, there's the role for the doctor to not be tolerant, but I think we also need to understand that there's also the role for close friends and family to kind of try and offer unconditional love and support, to say, look, this is going to be hard to half your body weight, but you've got to do it, and we're here for you. And I think that the tolerance conversation doesn't take into account either the fact that some things are empirically just true, we can say. It is true that if you have a certain height and a certain weight, your life expectancy will decrease by this much just due to obesity. But then there's also this sort of thing of like not understanding the difference between tolerance of someone's current state and trying to support them in order to get a future goal. And that, for example, is one of those issues where we can measure tolerance really easily, but it's hard to measure or simulate, for example, intent in these conversations
hmm.
online, and better understand, like, to what extent can we try and shape these conversations into something that's healthy as a society, right? It's hard to have free healthcare in the United States, and one of the reasons is because the United States is on average so incredibly obese that it costs billions of dollars a year. So if you want to socialize healthcare, there's a personal responsibility, right, that nobody wants to talk about, that is not different at all, really, from the same logic that the pro-vaccination people were saying about COVID early on, is that, oh, this is not about you, this is about society as a whole. It's like, well, look, we're going to be footing the bill for your hospital bills if you weigh 500 pounds and you're not 7 feet tall. So how can we address that in a logical and scientific but compassionate way is a hard circle to square.
Hmm.
I'll add though that I'm pretty, speaking for myself on this. I think Justin would agree though. I'm a realist about these issues, about social problems. I think we can quantify harms. Sometimes it's going to be difficult,
Mhm.
but I think we can pretty well quantify harms. And to the extent that we can do that, it becomes easier to have this discussion about when tolerance is justified and when it's not. What people do is they move right to their support or their opposition to something without looking at the data, without looking at the evidence. And sometimes there is no data available to assess, to quantitatively assess.
Mhm.
But my position is that if there's no data available, then it's hard to really be confident in your position of opposing or enabling something.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting because all of this seems so tied to identity, and kind of bringing it back to some of the earlier simulation work that Kevin and I did on analyzing what happens in these echo chambers. We know that if you're constantly presented with information, there's a great body of research even in the simulation literature that says that if you keep bombarding people with the same information, they internalize that information. It can become part of their identity. And one of the key components of that is that people want identities that allow them to maintain a positive self image, right? Um, and this is shown everywhere. It's also shown when the group that you identify with does something stupid. And the best example of this is the NRA, because the NRA in the United States, has millions of members. And whenever there's like a school shooting, someone who's on the head of the NRA inevitably is going to say something stupid and insensitive, and they do it every time without fail. And so when that happens, gun owners are presented with this in the news by friends of theirs who do not identify as NRA members, right? They're not dues paying or card holding, and they basically said, yes, they said that, but I don't believe that. And they disidentify from the group. They back off from the group. And it's because being part of that group no longer provides them with a positive self-image.
Mm.
One of the things that becomes really dangerous in cultures, and I mean, we see this in history, we see this today, and we do see this in the simulations that we work on, is that cult-like ideologies, when they become non-falsifiable, right, that means that you can never challenge them with data because there's always something that you can't get. Those basically become religiously held by individuals. You can't shift them from those beliefs. And you don't just see these in religious instances, right? You also see these, for example, in a lot of racists. So white supremacists, for example, they're basically convinced that they're right about this, and white people do this and all other minorities do that, and therefore nonsense. And you see this where they basically religiously hold their white nationalist identities or their white supremacist identities. And you do see this mixing with other identity groups, right? So you do see places like the Christian identity movement and the Elohim City groups in the United States, which are these cults that arise to reinforce these white nationalist beliefs. I know Pavel's here. Pavel, you've been doing some work, I think, in like pagan groups that may or may not be doing the same thing here and there too, right?
Hi, yeah. And some of the groups that I studied were in Ukraine, so it's now quite interesting because they are all fighting and they created all these militias. So you have this. Well, it turns out that having this kind of like cult, very cohesive background, especially with like also this warrior element, makes you a really good and effective fighter. And some of my respondents are already dead, so I guess they are fighting a lot.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you definitely see this kind of happening everywhere. You also do see this, of course, in like, just to go back to that body positivity movement for a moment. If you are medically obese, so we're saying, like, from an empirical standpoint, no one's denying that you're obese. If you find a movement that has an ideology that says this is okay, you are okay with who you are, that's highly drawing to you, because being part of that group reaffirms who you are, despite the fact that these people almost certainly have, body perception issues, right? Where they look themselves in the mirror and they're probably not happy with what they see, but they can have something that does allow them to be positive. So it's almost an interesting question: is, can we find a way to have the best of both worlds so that these people don't get depressed, right? Which also causes weight gain and overeating and other things that lead to further issues with obesity. Is there a way that we can find a way to validate these people and to help them, like, better understand who they are and be comfortable with who they are and positive with who they are, while also defining themselves by the change they want to see in themselves, so that that ideology that they have internalized is an ideology of betterment for their own health, even though they're not there yet. And I don't know if that's possible. It's one of those things where, like, the math works out, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can justify it in a simulation, but we don't know if that's empirically possible, but from the constraints of human psychology.
Someone, and on that note of constraints of humans, someone on Reddit said everything must be measured in context, and most people are too lazy to consistently do that. I
Totally.
feel a little bit objective to the concept of lazy. And then reminded of, like, well, because the world is moving far more quickly today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago. And so, the amount of stimuli that were, or was it, what does Laurent call them? Simulacra. Things that are thrown at us on a day-to-day basis has dramatically increased. And so, Elon's all about, like, oh, we got to be cyborgs and we got to, augment our human bodies in order to process this. There's some degree of truth to that, Justin. I know you object to the manner in which Elon in specific is doing that, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it kind of raises this question of, like, if there was some kind of a contextual scoring element, which it's like, yes, we believe in body positivity, and we encourage you and support you in making these changes, and we accept who you are today, and we accept who you are tomorrow, and accept who you were yesterday. and we support you in becoming, you know, this new version of yourself.
Yeah.
You know, and it's kind of like it's, I don't know, a measured tolerance, if you
Mhm.
will. But then the question is, who controls that score, and do people understand how it works, and then do they
The
you know.
score would have to be, in my opinion, right? When I think about how I would try and solve this problem computationally, that score would be emergent. It would be
Mm,
a unique scoring for every individual, where the algorithm is the same, but the data input is different.
mm,
And so this is one of the fun things for me about working with people like Kevin and Pavel, is like they take that sociological point of view that's at a level higher than what I normally deal with. I try and deal with the nuts and bolts of what is happening in someone's brain, and insofar as that brain transmits information or receives information from something else. And that's kind of my sweet spot. But then trying to understand how, when you iterate that process as like a recursive process, and you do this millions of times, understanding how that reflects against the real world is where, you know, the social sciences really shine here, because they have that information. And oftentimes context, for example, is kind of defined the way that the Redditor was kind of suggesting, right? Is
mm,
like everything is so contextualized, and it often is, particularly when you look up. And that's the way everyone wants to look at it, right? Cultural context is everything. But there's another way in which everything is contextualized. And this is something, you know, that when you realize it, I think it makes these complex issues a lot more simple, which is that you can also look down into the mind of someone, so to speak, and contextualize their beliefs, because their beliefs are defined by the other concepts in their mind that they also hold, and things that they've also learned, and things that they've also experienced. So no concept exists in a vacuum. No concept exists in a list. All concepts are intertwined and intertangled in crazy ways, right? That's why the moment we created word embedding systems and machine learning, like, accuracy took off, right? It's because we figured out a way to kind of quick and dirty throw these things together. So from a mathematical standpoint, you can also zoom into someone's head and say, oh, okay, obesity, how do you contextualize the idea of obesity? And that's very different for different people. So,
mm.
you know, Brian, you've been in great shape the entire time I've known you now, for like 14 years. You've never been obese. Let me put it that way. Okay. You've never been obese.
I agree with that statement.
Okay. Whereas me, on the other hand, I have crossed that weight threshold into obesity in the past, in the not so distant past, actually, within the last few years, and then made a very concerted effort to make sure that I lost the weight that I needed to in order to trim down and make myself a little bit more healthy. And part of that is because I think, you know, certain people contextualize what's happening to them in their experiences and the way they define their experiences in unique ways. And sometimes they have an attachment to it that's so incredibly negative that they can't do anything about it. For me, I actually had I was overweight for several years, but it wasn't until I finally like saw myself, and I literally looked at a chart, like one of the BMI charts, and I was like, okay, here's my height and here's my weight, and I just like kept going, and I was like, oh shit. And I finally realized that like I had crossed the line. I was medically obese according to like those charts. And it's not like I'm big boned or I have some excuse like that. I'm like, it's mostly muscle. It's not. It was mostly Domino's pizza. And so I had to
Oh,
just figure out a way. Oh, dude, stuffed crust. It's my boy. Um,
I
pepperoni
was expecting
sausage.
it's mostly beer, but yeah.
Oh, it was that too. So one of the things, I don't drink
Wonderful.
a lot of beer anymore. If I'm gonna have alcohol, I'm
Mm.
gonna have like a whiskey or one of the local Slovak liquors in the evening with my wife, and that's gonna be the way it
High
goes.
fructose corn syrup.
People
Yeah,
have an
right.
essentialist people have an essentialist bias that we're up against here, which is that,
Hmm.
and this seems to be cross-cultural, although it varies by culture a little bit, but they have an essentialist bias. In other words, how we behave is a reflection of who we really are. And people have a hard time getting out of this. So if I have behaved in a way that I overeat, then that must be a reflection of who I am. I'm just fat. I'm a fat person. And you see in these circles that identifying as fat is a kind of a badge of honor. You're rejecting the hegemonic narrative in favor of thinness. The capitalist medical establishment that just wants to make money off of people with diet pills, etc. So being fat becomes who you are. It becomes an essential component of who you are. Uh, there's an identity dynamic to this. There's a cognitive bias dynamic to this. I also want to just throw out there, because Brian mentioned a second ago, the simulacra. I can't use that word because it's going to bring us to Baudrillard and postmodernism, and I'm going to get cold brain. But it is the case that culture is circulating much more rapidly, much more fluidly now. And I think that in that kind of circumstance where people can adopt and shuck off identities fairly easily, within a single day, I can adopt 2 identities and reject them the next day.
Hmm.
This is novel in human history. And I think that one of the consequences that results that we have yet to grapple with as social scientists is that in this sort of unstable and highly fluid identity context, people are going to seek to validate ascribed identities, which we thought were a thing of the past. In other words, your race, your place of birth. The thinking of social scientists, your age, your gender, the thinking of social scientists were that these ascribed identities, the sort of identities you're born with or
Hmm.
perceived to be born with, are going to be less important. People instead are going to seek out voluntary group memberships. They're going to start to identify more with their occupation. But I think that there's a limit to that. And the more unstable people perceive culture to be, the more they start to retreat back to their ascribed identities and to seek an essential nature in them, to perceive a sense of stability, a sense of
Yeah.
personal continuity from day to day. And so I think that's why we're seeing the increased salience of identities like race or gender, or believing yourself to be essentially fat. You know, you're just born this way. It's genetic. This is how they talk about it. There's nothing I can do about it. One way to interpret this sort of shift in the salience of ascribed versus achieved identities is people are looking for a sense of stability. And as soon as they leave their front door, they're confronted with a panoply of possible identities. And so they retreat to these ascribed identities more than they might have 20 or 30 or even, definitely 100 years ago.
So one of the things that's interesting is
I identify as human.
Yeah.
there you go. That's a good one. It's very flexible. and
Actually, what's
useful.
funny is I actually don't. We identify as holobionts.
Totally.
There you go. I like it. I like it. So one of the things that I found in earlier research with an architecture that Laurent and I actually did for religious extremism, the prototype of it was just, can I simulate identity, like psychological identity? Turns out you can. And one of the things that was interesting is that I did this in a multi-agent artificial intelligence system. So it wasn't just I was simulating the identity of one person, because that doesn't work. You need to have other people in order for you to kind of bounce ideas off of, and in order for you to find a social identity of things that other people in your environment believe in order for you to anchor yourself into a social category. Because it's the idea, the saying no man is an island. That also is true of an identity. No identity is an island. You have your self identity, and everyone has one, but no social identity can exist without those interactions. One of the parameters in this AI system was basically reducible to the word tolerance. Naturally, I used words that were stupid and too long and don't need to be repeated, but that once you clear out the jargon, it basically reduces to tolerance, right? How much are you willing to maintain a social link with an individual with whom you disagree on certain issues, and how much disagreement can you have before you go, no, I don't need to talk to that guy anymore. What's interesting is when you increase that tolerance level, there is a bridge where basically the social grouping itself starts to kind of break down and become so chaotic that you go into one of 2 different phases as you vary this parameter. When you vary tolerance to the extremes, either society basically breaks down and everyone just sits on their own and they don't like to integrate or discuss things with other people because they've taken their own personal experiences as an individual, and they don't share them with anyone else in their mind, and it becomes a problem, right? Like, they're not outside. That's one of those things I say. It's like, they're all in front of their computer. They're never in the woods. Those people is too much. On the other hand, right, when you go to the other extreme, you basically get people forming these very small, cohesive groups that get extremely tight-knit. They are pretty much the paradigm of cults, where everyone has to believe the same thing. And the moment you don't believe the same thing, you're kicked out of the group. And then they should go searching to find a new person to fit into the group. And so there's a sweet spot, mathematically speaking, at least in this definition of tolerance, that helps society stabilize itself. And because of just the way, our monkey brains work as humans, there's actually it kind of helps itself, because we can only talk to so many people at once. So the cult should never get to the point of millions. It's only that you see cults in the points of millions when you get mass information distribution. And one of those things that I think is very interesting is, social networks, when they start to censor and they start to promote algorithmically certain information over others, and it's not a timeline based effect, but it's rather, an engagement based AI model fit, you start to get these echo chambers where it goes into the cultish region. The alternative is if you basically, you never talk with anyone, or you talk with a bunch of people and you're changing your identity all the time. You don't have a stable set of social relationships. You kind of become myopic and you become like, your own person, but you have trouble integrating in with other social groups, which also isn't healthy.
So you spoke about the sweet spot. So on the, I don't know, from 0 to 1, when 0 is like you don't talk to anyone, and 10 is a cult. What is the sweet spot?
It's
What
a little
number?
bit, it's a little higher than the midpoint, like 0.6 to 0.7.
Closer to tolerance or closer to cultishness?
Closer to cultishness.
Interesting.
Yeah. And this gets us back to our title, right? Practicing safe sex. Is that it's okay to have a sect. It's how you define it and how you construct your sect that makes it safe or not. Because, we're humans, as all primates, right? Most living animals, right, have some version of sociality that they rely on for their survival, and we are no different. And if it's material survival, that's obviously the case, but less and less that's important for us because, you have Amazon. If you can work from home as a programmer, you can buy something on Amazon and you will survive. But your mental health will degrade to the point that you will start to see mental health issues starting to be the largest killer. And if I'm not mistaken, the largest killer in the United States right now for people between 15 and 45 is fentanyl, not COVID. So the biggest crisis in the United States from a health perspective right now has nothing to do with the virus. It has to do with mental health and people's like addiction and searching for something else to change the way that their state of mind is, and it is killing millions of people.
Here's how
So
I look at it.
loneliness will come, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not, groupishness is not the problem. Humans evolved in groups. Our brains are wired to adopt group memberships and group identities. It's the porousness of boundaries. I think this is
Mm.
how I understand what Justin's research shows. So it's you encourage people to be groupish. You just don't want rigidity, closed boundaries, so that it's hard to leave the group or hard to join another group. So not so much the groupishness, but the porousness of the boundaries are
I like
what
that.
rubber meets the road. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that porousness analogy as well because I know I use it in some of my idea with like extreme identities like identity fusion. But the other thing about porousness that's useful, I think, to keep in mind when the rubber hits the road, right, outside of just the papers, but when, in the real life, is not only do we not exist as individuals, our groups are not the only groups. And regardless of how we identify, we need to have that porous boundary with that group so we can include other people, we can exclude other people if we need to, right? We have a healthy boundary of tolerance, but also we need to be able to see beyond the boundary of our group in order to cooperate and trade and empathize with people who are not in our group in order to have a healthy society. Otherwise, your society is basically limited to 300 people. Mathematically, beyond that, it breaks down. You can't transfer information efficiently enough to stabilize your identity, is what that comes down to. So above like 300, maybe 500 or so, you have to start getting like sub tribes, basically, in order for it to work. But at the scale of what we see now today in our society, you have to be able to look through your group and see another group and say, this is this guy. He's different from me, but like these are our commonalities. These are the things that we can agree on. Here's how I can, reach out and trust this individual, even though I don't know him, in order to cooperate and engage in trade. Buy things from him, sell things to him, and trust that the money's coming, the currency's flowing. Like we need this level of cooperation in order to actually sustain a society. Otherwise, why even pay your taxes? Just burn it down. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people kind of forget when the rubber hits the road is we also have to be able to empathize between groups. And having a stable thread that ropes all those groups together is critical.
That's kind of what's been on my mind through a lot of this conversation is like intolerance, but has to be expressed with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That how does the doctor empathetically not tolerate their patient not taking care of themselves, and affirm that it's okay for you to be 400 pounds? How do you empathetically tell them that's not okay?
I think it's easier than we think. It's distinguishing the sin from the sinner, not to get too Christian-y on y'all. It's distinguishing the behavior from the person. And we constantly conflate these. And people want to conflate them because of this essentialist bias. So they want to say they're fat because it's genetic and their mom was fat and there's nothing to do about it. So it's incumbent on the doctor to be a little bit of an informal social psychologist to realize that you're swimming upstream with this essentialist bias, but to the degree that you can get that person to disaggregate who they are as a person, their loyalty to friends, their generosity when they volunteer at the dog shelter, whatever, from the size of their body, you disaggregate these two things. You are not the size of your body. There might be a genetic component to it, but it's not genetic determinism by any stretch of the imagination. To the degree that the doctor can do a little informal social psychology, disaggregate those two things for somebody, it will be easier for them to lose weight.
Yeah.
I think an interesting thing in light of what we now know about social networks and the way they work from a data perspective too is how can we mix that sort of tolerance with empathy, or intolerance with empathy, if you want to call it that. How can we algorithmically implement that?
Empathetic intolerance.
Empathetic intolerance, dude, I love it. In 5 minutes, Brian's going to own empatheticintolerance.com.
Hey Siri, buy. No, I'm just kidding.
But yeah, so I think one of those things that could be very useful is to figure out how can we algorithmically create empathetic intolerance so that it could be instituted on social networks. Some of the work that we were doing with Minds and that discussion is very much leaning towards that. But the idea with Minds is also that there's an open source component to how this works. And we actually tell people, if we can do this, we tell people so that Instagram can do it. Because one of the clearest things that came out last October with the Frances Haugen leak at Facebook is that Instagram knew consistently that it was having a huge detrimental effect on teenage girls. And they knew that there were certain things that they could do with the algorithm to help, but it seemed like it may have impacted the bottom line and they weren't necessarily able to do it. So is there a way that we could algorithmically create a sort of approach that could help people with body image issues in particular? Because that was the hot topic, right? It was not, obfuscated under some statistical thing to say, oh, look, it's hurting body. It was like the loudest, most clear signal from those documents. So that's one of those things I think is a really interesting problem for this kind of work to try and solve is, empathetic intolerance.
Well, thank you both so much for coming and sharing and getting to the point of empathetic intolerance. It's really interesting to talk about, and also I'll throw this in as a point of agreement, but not continue the conversation because we don't have more time. Is reading an article about anti-Asian hate and microaggressions. And one of the things that they suggested was to separate the intent from the impact. And it seems like that structure is very similar here, is separating the person from the, what did you say again, Kevin?
So you got to separate the identity from behavior. And it's difficult because we use our behavior to verify our identities. So this isn't an easy task, but conceptually it's clear that that's the path.
Yeah, I mean, just because you fail does not mean you are a failure.
Right. Oh, it will feel like that though. And it will reduce other people's cognitive load to use that assumption. So it's sort of the path of least resistance to be essentialist, but it leads to all sorts of pathologies that aren't worth the bother.
It's interesting because so much of that deals with intelligence. People who can learn can also learn about themselves.
Well, thank you so much again for coming, and thank you everyone else for joining us and practicing safe sex. And Pavel, great to see your face again. Elise and Sam, thanks for always being here and asking great questions and holding space. And for those who are listening on the stream, we will be back again next week, every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. If you don't know what Pacific time
next
is,
week
it's an hour
with
prior
Jen
to this time.
Lindsay.
Ooh. Would you like to talk for a minute on who Jen Lindsay is?
Yeah, so Jen is the founder of So Fair Films out of Rome, and she is the director and one of the producers of a documentary on simulating religious violence that is basically featuring the work that Laurent and I did when we met 7 years ago. So I look increasingly homeless and academic throughout the length of this film, but it's an interesting topic, and it talks about like a lot of the people that we've collaborated with over the years, and how we've tried to do it. It focuses more on sort of like Laurent and his story than me and the technology necessarily, but it's we were in Boston at the time, and so it focuses on Boston bombing. It does deal with like the immigration crisis in Lesbos, all sorts of interesting work that our travels took us on for several years.
Beautiful. Thank you so much again, and we'll be back next week. All right.
Very cool. Thanks, guys.
This was fun.
Thanks, yeah. Kevin, hey, thanks for that. I liked that porous boundary. It's got me thinking. It's good. It's a good word.
Open systems, groups that are more open to outsiders with some limitation, are more creative, are more flexible, they adapt quicker. Open systems are the key to solving any problem. And what that looks like at the group level is porous boundaries.
Yeah. I use that on my streaming. I get trolls that come and I allow all of them in. That's the porousness. But then I still establish the boundary. As soon as the troll is in, I let them know, okay, you're here, you're welcome. But here's the boundary. If you choose to respect the boundary, you're welcome to continue being here. But if you choose to disrespect that boundary, it's just as porous going back out. See you later.
Yeah. I like that.
Besides me, what do they
go.
usually troll?
See you later.
I gotta go.
Anything and anything. Trolls like
They're
to
just
troll.
hopping in the troll.
Yeah,
Trolls gonna troll.
They just want their troll. Like, they just want it. That's why I know that's what they want. They just want to poke fun. They just want to have that fun. It's like what they want. And I'm like, you're welcome to do that here. I like to troll too, but we got to troll with love. We got to troll with the intent.
Like a roast.
And the outcome of causing like a positive reaction versus like a negative, hateful reaction. And it works like 80% of the time. 20% of the time.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, 20% of the time, the troll just continues in a negative way. And it's like, okay, the exit's that way. We'll see you later. Bye.
Yeah.
You know what's funny? That we are just scientifically proving a lot of theological concepts, old 2,500 years old, stuff like that. So funny.
We're scientifically proving things that we've known for a very long time.
Yeah.
I actually had a guy tell me that once in what I was expecting to be a much more cordial conversation about like this simulation on religious violence we did. I was interviewed on BBC Radio 4, and I was the counter to me was this guy from Cambridge University, and he was like, we've known about these results, like there's biblical passages about some of their findings, like and we've been studying them, and in recent years we've studied these Bible passages, we've come to the same result about intergroup violence. And to which my only response was like, yeah, but it took you 2,000 years to figure it out. I ran this computer simulation for 2 weeks, so like imagine what we'll be able to do in the next 2,000 years on the back of this technology. And he didn't really have a response, and he didn't talk to me for quite some time. And when I tried to email him to follow up on it, but now he's the director of the Wolf Institute and has hired us to do work on intergroup relations. So Pavel, this is Ed Kessler from the Wolf Institute at Cambridge.
Okay, that's a good one.
So he's either forgiven or forgotten me. Probably forgotten.
Probably forgiven.
No, he's Sir Edward Kessler. He's not worried about at the time Mr. Justin Lane. He doesn't give a crap about me.
Okay.
But it was fun.
I have a follow-up question about the cult, complete tolerance scale.
Mm-hmm.
So if we know that from like -10 is a cult and +10 is a complete tolerance, and you said like the sweet spot will be a little closer to cult, so that's like -1, -2, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sweet spot.
Well, yeah, I do it between 0 and 1, so it's like 0.6, 0.7. Like in that area is a tolerant sweet spot. Anything higher than 0.7, and it starts to cause too much groupishness. Anything lower than 0.6, and the model isn't really stable.
Interesting. So the sweet spot is actually quite small.
Yeah.
So where
it is,
are
but
we?
it's also
So
contingent. There's other things that you can vary to widen that sweet spot, which is kind of interesting in itself.
Okay. Well, I would love a conversation about that eventually.
Yeah, I think this model had like 40 parameters in the agent AI work. So it's like you can move this one thing, but then there's all this other stuff too. So
if you know the sweet spot, where are we as a society now?
At the moment, I think that we are like closer to like 0.5 in it depends on which society. In Slovakia, for example, I think that it's above 0.5. Slovakia, I would say, is more socially stable. It generally, Slovakia runs a little closer to 1 than the US does, and I think a lot of countries do. The US as a cultural like the culture of the US, its nature is to tread dangerously close to the lower bound of this system. Whereas other cultures, like in Singapore and in China, well, I would say China is dangerously on the other side at this point. North Korea dangerously on the other side, but Singapore, for example, is the all other side. It's trending dangerously close to the upper bound of the safe zone. And so as people move in and out, and every couple of years, these things can change quite rapidly, particularly in democracies, as the whims of the environment, socially, economically, and biologically speaking, can really shift what we believe and how we believe pretty drastically in terms of like big crises. So like the Ukraine now, it would be higher in towards cultishness now than it was just, I would say, a year ago, which is higher than it was 15 years ago before the annexation of Crimea. These things typically create more cultishness, and I think you also see that with your work with the paramilitaries on the ground there, because the paramilitaries proliferate under those stresses, and in some cases I'd be willing to bet that they fracture under extreme stresses. So I'd be interested to know if any of those paramilitaries in Central and Eastern Europe generally, in light of the most recent invasion into the Ukraine, may have had some sort of schism moment because it created they went too close to 1 and even couldn't maintain their internal boundary anymore, and so the group might split into 2, or a subgroup might splinter off into it. That's what this model would predict is likely to happen with certain Central and Eastern European paramilitaries.
Well, the Ukrainian paramilitaries, it certainly strengthened them. The Polish paramilitaries, it strengthened them. Funny thing, the biggest Slovak paramilitary, the one that we know, the Slovenskí branci, I think it did not strengthen them. In the beginning, it looked like that, because it was like, finally there is the action, that's why we exist, right, and so on. But then they like offered their help to all possible humanitarian organizations, and they were refused by all of them because they have this PR that's too pro-Russian, and people are sensitive to that. And now obviously humanitarian organizations are more either religious or left-leaning, and they just didn't want to do anything with them. And I think that like,
do you think that's a trust issue or a PR issue? Do you think they won't work with Slovenskí branci because they're like, oh, we don't want to be affiliated with these guys because they've been pro-Russia, which seems like a lost opportunity, because these guys are trying to help, and they're criticizing Russia, and they want to help, and they could be very helpful people. They're an organized group of guys.
Oh, they see them as fascists.
So is it that they feel like they can't trust them? Like if they like show up to help, they're gonna like take a bunch of clothes and run away?
No.
It's just that they won't cooperate with them for political reasons.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
See you, Sam.
See ya.
Very cool. Well, I have to go because I am utterly exhausted. I have COVID, and so I spent most of the afternoon napping all day with my son, who also has COVID. He was watching Lego shows, and I was trying to sleep as best I could. And so I'm going to go and have myself some vitamins and some tea, and maybe take a shower, and then go.
Smart.
Well, hey, get well soon.
I will. We're doing fine.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm like triple vaxxed. Even my son is double vaxxed at this point. So like we're just tired, but like a little bit of soup, a little bit of tea, we'll be good in a week.
Yeah. Okay.
Very cool. Talk to you guys.
Man.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Nice conversation. As always, practicing safe sex, y'all. Thanks for being here. Thanks for hanging out, your comments. We didn't get much comments today, but we'll be back next week with this conversation, practicing success. Yeah, hopefully it gives you a lot to think about how we can do better and create more peaceful groupings, communities around us, and more righteousness around us as individuals. Yeah, it's complicated. Lots of complicated things we talk about here, but I appreciate you all being here for these conversations. If you enjoyed this conversation and want more, if you're interested in tea, if you're interested in technology and righteousness and living a good life, please give me a follow. I do stream regularly and would love to get to know you all much better. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your week and stay healthy, stay hydrated, stay well rested. So much love to you all. Bye-bye.